My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are looking at Paul's doctrine of resurrection from 1 Corinthians 15. But what we've been involved in for the last several videos is an examination of the parallel passages, parallel to 1 Corinthians 15, of Romans 5 through 8. There's absolutely no question whatsoever that Paul is dealing with the exact same issues, the exact same doctrines in Romans 5 to 8 that he is dealing with in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, in 1 Corinthians 15:56, Paul said that the sting of death is sin. Thus, one more time, to deal with sin is to deal with death. To overcome sin is to overcome death, i.e., resurrection. So, in our last video, we began an examination of Romans chapter 6, where Paul told the Romans, "Do you not know that so many of you, as were baptized into Christ..." Now, let me very quickly take note of this. Back in chapter 5, Paul talked about being in Adam or in Christ. To be in Adam was to die. To be in Christ was life. It was resurrection. So when Paul in Romans chapter 6 continues that discussion of Adam, sin and death, and Christ's righteousness and life, and he tells us that to be baptized into Christ was to be baptized into death, we have to ask a question. Okay, being baptized into Christ is to be baptized into death. What death? Well, it's not to be baptized into the death of Adam, because it's exactly the opposite of it. Well, then what death is a person baptized into when they're baptized into Christ? Well, let's let Paul answer this in Romans chapter 6 when he says, if we have been united, boy, I love this concept, united with Christ. And once again here, the Greek is very, very powerful. United with, joined with Christ. Now notice the terminology one more time. Likeness of his death. You and I, if we have been baptized with Christ, did not and do not experience physical death exactly like Christ. You've got to catch the power of Paul's use of this term, likeness. Homoiomati is the Greek. Likeness. He uses this term. It is not one-to-one, Jesus' physical death, our physical death. No. It is Jesus' death and our joining in the likeness of that death. Now watch this. If we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be. Now notice the future tense. We were, we shall be. Now notice that we go back here to verse 4, that we were buried with Christ by baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk. Now that's the subjunctive concept, that if you did this, then you should be this way. It doesn't speak of a completed reality. You experience this, you ought to be. You should be. And now he says, if we have been joined with Christ in the likeness of his death, we shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. Well, a lot of people say that absolutely proves that Paul is talking about biological resurrection. No, let's think about that for a moment. If we have been joined with Christ in the likeness of his death, well, wait a minute. Being put down in water That's not physical death. Being raised out of the physical water of baptism is not being raised out of biological death. And so to be raised in the likeness of his resurrection is not to be raised out of biological death. Paul's use of likeness here proves that Paul is not talking about a one-to-one correlation. He is absolutely not talking about, oh, well, you died physically just like Jesus, you were buried physically just like Jesus, and you'll be raised physically just like Jesus. Isn't that more than obvious? You were baptized into his death, not his biological death. Now, I told you in the last video that I proved that. Well, just read verses 9, 10, and 11, and which we will get to in another video. But for the point of time, right here, what you have to see in Paul's discussion of being, watch this, of being in Christ, is to be in his death. But let me reiterate what I said in the last video, what I've already suggested here. To be baptized into the death of Christ is not to be baptized into biological death. Every person in this world who either has lived or will live is going to die biologically. Now, there's a whole lot of similarity here between what Paul is saying, to be baptized into the death of Christ, and what Paul will say in Romans chapter 8 and 11, where he says, if the Spirit of Christ is in you, the body is dead. What? Say what, Paul? Are you telling me that if and only if I have the Spirit of Christ in me, my body will die? No. I'm going to die biologically, whether I have the Spirit of Christ or not, right? Okay. I'm going to die biologically, whether or not I'm baptized into the death of Christ. And so we come back to, if we were buried with him in the likeness of his death, we shall also be raised in the likeness of his resurrection. Let me reiterate, Paul is not presenting a one-to-one physical reality. Likeness of Jesus' physical death, to be sure, likeness of his death. He was buried physically, to be sure. Likeness of his burial. He was raised physically, to be sure. Raised in the likeness of his resurrection. Not a one-to-one, a likeness. And folks, once we catch the idea of this, once we see that Paul is not discussing one-to-one physical and physical, but physical and likeness, then it is more than obvious that when Paul says, if we've been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall be in the likeness of his resurrection, that he simply cannot be talking about physical resurrection. Likeness doesn't mean preciseness. And boy, we got a whole lot more on Paul's doctrine of Adam's sin and death, Christ, righteousness, resurrection, and life. We'll see you on the flip side.